Okay, so I think we'll go in order listed. So Henrik Kleven at LSE will present the first discussion.
Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to the conference. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to Richard for a very clear presentation. So we've been told as discussants that we're supposed to not discuss the paper that was presented as such, but sort of give our own view on the field. So I'm going to take that seriously by saying a lot of stuff that overlaps in many ways with what Richard has been saying, but takes the discussion in a slightly different direction. I mean, overall, I basically agree with everything that Richard said, so it's not so interesting for you to hear me list all the ways in which I agree with Richard. So I'm going to talk about some slightly different things. So first of all, like Richard, I wanted to just frame the discussion in terms of the different margins of earnings response to taxes that we can think about. So overall, of course, we have potential responses through education, through time of entry into the labor market, whatever you do while in the labor market, and the time of retirement. So what I think the work by Richard and his co-authors show in an extremely simple and compelling way is that there are three margins of earnings response where a lot of the action, or maybe most of the action, is likely to take place. And those three margins are the two extensive margin at each end of the working life cycle and the extensive margin during the working life cycle, particularly for women with young children. Okay, so I think that those cross-country life cycle labor supply graphs that Richard has showed with Antoine Bouchot and Guy Laroque are incredibly insightful in terms of showing that. So what I wanted to do here was just first to be maybe a little bit self-serving in terms of just pointing out a fourth extensive response that Richard did not mention, but I think might also be important, and it's the migration margin, in particular for top earners. So we didn't used to think that migration was a huge deal for labor income. It's been a big deal for a long time in the literature on capital income taxation, where international capital mobility has always been high on the agenda. But some of the recent work that I've been involved in suggests that actually migration at the top of the distribution could be quite responsive as well. And that's going to have some policy implications potentially. And this is an issue that I think is if anything, it's going to become more important in the future than it is now as labor markets become internationally more integrated. So 2 points I think that are specifically important for the migration stuff is, well, the policy conclusions that it's going to lead to depends in a very important way on whether international policy coordination is feasible, and if the migration response is important, that in itself is a good argument for coordinating policy across countries, or it can also be, of course, across tax jurisdictions within a country, such as states in the US. The other point is that, other things equal, the migration response will tend to be a bigger deal for smaller countries than for larger countries, and that has to do with the fact that, just in a very mechanical sense, other things equal, migration elasticities will tend to be larger for small countries than for big countries, which is something that we've known for a long time from the literature on capital income tax competition and tax havens. Okay, so I just wanted to sort of mention that one. So continuing to the integrated view of taxes and benefits that the Merle's review was pushing and that Richard was emphasizing now, that's obviously a very good point, an important point. We want to get the effective tax wedges right when analyzing labor supply. So we want to include for all of the taxes and all of the welfare benefits that impact those labor supply incentives. But one question that came to my mind when reading Richard's paper and seeing his discussion now is, why stop at taxes and benefits? Tax revenue is used for a lot of public spending that is potentially also important for labor supply. Okay, and public spending patterns vary greatly across countries in ways that may be important to understand some of those cross-country comparisons of labor supply. Okay, and the kinds of things that I have in mind is, of course, a public provision or subsidization of childcare, subsidization of elderly care, public transportation, housing policies even, and so on, right? So what these policies are is that they're essentially subsidies to goods that are complementary to work effort. Okay. In fact, in the empirical literature and sometimes theoretical literature, we treat these things as fixed cost of work, which is like saying that they're perfect complements to work effort, which creates a very strong tax argument, optimal tax argument for subsidizing those things. So what I'm doing here is, of course, I'm making one of the oldest argument in public finance, which is a Ramsey argument. In the public finance literature, the Milesian view has really taken over in a very strong way, and I think we tend to forget a little bit about the old insights of Ramsey, and I think that's a pity, so I wanted to bring that back in. Also note that when I say Ramsey, I could also say Atkinson and Stiglitz. So Atkinson-Stiglitz, the Atkinson-Stiglitz proposition about when we want to subsidize or tax specific goods is often seen as very different from Ramsey, but in fact it's not that different. All that Atkinson-Stiglitz is just, it raises the bar a little bit for when you want to use those instruments, but qualitatively it's actually fairly similar. Basically, if you have these work complements, you want to potentially subsidize them. Okay, so I also think so the argument that has always been used and that has potentially been most compelling against using Ramsey differentiation in tax policy has been an information argument, essentially that we lack the information that we need about all the relevant cross-elasticities between different goods and labor supply to implement the Ramsey formula. You know, that argument appears pretty good, but I think it's flawed for two reasons. One is that even though we might not have great elasticity estimates, I think we do know that some goods, such as publicly provided childcare, is a good complement for work. And the other thing is that by ignoring Ramsey differentiation, claiming ignorance, we are paradoxically and implicitly taking an extremely strong stand on the whole Slutsky matrix. It's a very particular demand system that has to be satisfied then for not using Ramsey differentiation. And I think if we have a little bit of ignorance, there are other sort of defaults that would be more natural to take. Okay, so that's sort of one thing. So one thing is that potentially we do want to use other policy instruments such as childcare subsidization. But the other thing is that once we do that, that's going to interact with the policy conclusions we come to with respect to income taxes and welfare benefits, right? So if we take childcare subsidies as an example, they're actually often universally provided. Note that. So often these policies are universal, but still they affect labor supply incentives precisely through complementarity in utility. So for example, if we take the earned income tax credit in the US, or the working family tax credit as it's called in the UK, childcare subsidies have an EITC element through this complementarity, and if we have strong childcare subsidies, we do not necessarily need an EITC. So I think one thing which is interesting is that we look at the cross-country correlation. If we plot across countries, the labor force participation rate against the effective participation taxes, including both taxes and the benefits, that correlation really doesn't line up with the EITC argument. For example, some of the countries in the world with the largest participation taxes, such as Scandinavia, also have the largest labor force participation rates. Okay, we can think about what are the reasons for that. In very general terms, it might be because of either culture or incentives. And I think since this is the Becker Friedman Institute, I'm going to ignore the culture part and go straight to the incentive part. And what is of course, food for thought here is that those countries with those highest participation taxes actually have the most generous childcare policies, the most generous policies for elderly care, public transport and infrastructure, and so on. But I think the bottom line of this is the call for a research agenda. Because of where I'm coming from, that should be, in my view, a micro-based research agenda that provides more evidence on how labor supply responds to some of these spending policies. Okay, so now let me take a step back and just think a little bit about, I think, public finance as a field, especially over the past 10 years or so, I think. So the recent success of public finance rests on a very nice and transparent link between theory and evidence. And I think as we make progress on these questions, we want to develop theory and evidence together. So what we've done in PF typically is to combine some analytical work that leads to some policy rules that are based on things we can estimate, and then we go out and estimate those things based on a clear identification strategy, often using quasi-experimental variation and administrative data. So this is what has recently become known as the sufficient statistic approach, a term that has been coined recently, but a philosophy which is in fact extremely old. And again, I don't know, this has become turning into a big defense of Ramsey, but again, I think Ramsey is in some sense, arguably the philosophical father of the sufficient statistic approach. So what this approach tells us is that there are three things that matter for how we design a tax policy. There are the elasticities, and that's basically what this conference is about. There's the shape of the income distribution, and there are the social welfare weights. So one thing I just wanted to point out is that I think that the social welfare weights is in some sense a little bit the problem of this literature, because they're so important for the conclusions that we come to, and at least at the moment, they're not empirical at all. Okay, so take again the EATC as an example. The argument for the EATC is often presented as something that has to do mainly with a certain composition of extensive margin and intensive margin elasticities, but in fact, the EATC argument is not mainly about elasticities. First and foremost, it's based on a certain set of social welfare weights where you care enough for the working poor relative to other individuals in society. And without saying something about those social welfare weights, we can't even say whether we want an EATC or not. So I think that's sort of a problem. The traditional argument, of course, been to say, well, academics should estimate elasticities and talk about the shape of the income distribution, and then we leave the social welfare weights to the policymakers. I can totally see the sense of that, but the problem is if we do that, we're leaving so much of the theory, such an important part of the theory outside the realm of academic research that it's going to be probably very hard to reach a consensus. And I think sort of the social welfare weight importance in optimal tax theory is one of the reasons why we are not really sort of approaching that much of a consensus over time about optimal tax policy, and sometimes go a little bit in circles. Okay, so let me skip this one and sort of go a little bit more to the bottom line, and in the interest of saving a little bit of time. So as Richard said, I think that the bottom line of Richard's talk and paper is a great one. So here's a quote from the conclusion of the paper: focus tax policy on improving incentives around points in the lifetime where labor supply responses, especially at the extensive margin, are found to be strongest, largely for parents with young children and for older workers. Another way of saying that, what that statement really boils down to is a very simple policy prescription. We want child-dependent taxes and we want age-dependent taxes. Interestingly, Richard never used the term age-dependent taxes, but I think that is essentially what is the implication of what he was talking about. There is some recent work on age-dependent taxation, and that work leads to quite contrasting views, and those contrasting views have precisely to do with how we think about human capital and the potential endogeneity of human capital, which is at the core of everything that Richard was talking about. So basically, you have two kinds of papers on age-dependent taxation. One body of work is based on exogenous human capital. That's work by Matt Weinzierl, Mike Gollisaw, Florian Werning, and so on. Now, what that literature tells us is that taxes should increase with age. In other words, the exact opposite of the policy recommendation that Richard comes with. But the argument for it is also a completely different one. It has nothing to do with elasticities, which is what Richard is talking about. If we take the Weinzierl paper, which is the simplest one, it's very, very simple. It's that Pareto parameter of the income distribution that Richard was talking about. That one declines with age. And why is that? That's because older workers have a much fatter upper tail of the income distribution than younger workers. Why do they have that? Well, they have that because of those experience effect, those age-wage profiles that we're looking at. Okay, so that's what gives that effect. But of course, the key tension here in that literature is that it takes those age-wage profiles as completely exogenous, as opposed to something that has to do with labor supply decisions made early on in life and the associated experience effects, things that may themselves respond to taxes and transfers. So that motivates some of the work I've done together with Michael Best on optimal taxation with learning by doing and career effects of work effort, thinking among other things about age-dependent taxation. And in that kind of work, we do indeed find that taxes should decrease with age. There are two reasons for it. One is the efficiency stuff that has to do with incentives and elasticities, closely related to what Richard was talking about. But there's also another really, well, I think kind of interesting reason why we want age-dependent taxation in that direction, which is not just about the elasticities, it's really an equity argument, it's ultimately a tagging argument, and that is that those age-wage profiles that we see empirically, what they lead to is a negative correlation between age and ability, conditional on earnings. Okay, so we're thinking if the policy instrument we have in mind is that we have an annual earnings-based tax, it's not a fully history-dependent tax or anything fancy like that in the optimal tax literature. It's an annual earnings-based tax as we have in the real world, and then potentially supplementing that with some age dependence, then in fact we do want taxes that are decreasing with age. You can see it from this graph, which is the one that Richard showed. So basically, so the laser thing doesn't work here, but we have these profiles here. What that means is that if we focus on a given wage level, so here we have different educations, just think of those as different exogenous abilities to make it more consistent with the release model. If we look at a given wage level, the young workers at that wage level will be higher ability than the older workers at that wage level, essentially because the younger workers got there quicker. So they must be higher ability, and that means that there is that negative correlation between ability and age, conditional on earnings, and that gives a very strong argument for age-dependent taxes. Okay, so I'm running out of time. There are some loose ends here. There are many other things that I could have talked about that I didn't get to talk about. I think just one final thing that I think is really important, what Richard is talking about in those cross-country graphs that he showed us, is this thing about the labor to supply decision of young adults, and in particular the time of entry, or we might want to think about how much of that is education and how much is time of entry given educational attainment. It's something, so coming from Scandinavia, this is an issue which is always discussed in Scandinavia. There's no great evidence on it in Scandinavia, but there is this Scandinavian narrative which is, okay, we have this super compressed wage distribution and very high taxes. Incentives are really weak. For that reason, young people are taking forever to finish their education. They go to the school of life, as it's always called there, which basically means to go backpacking in South Asia for a couple of years and postponing your thesis or your final exam. There hasn't been any great evidence on it, but it's a narrative that's pretty compelling. And anecdotally, it fits. There's anecdotal evidence of it. I think sort of on that same general thing, I also think some of the recent work by Abramitsky and Lavie on the Israeli kaput stuff is very interesting in terms of understanding some of these education effects of redistributive policies. So, thanks.